This is Portugal. In the lead up to the Eurozone Crisis, Portugal was an outlier. Whilst many economies went on an incredible run, it didn't have such a good time. Not only underperforming the average Eurozone growth rate, but unemployment actually rose from 3.8% to 7.5%. Compare this against the likes of Greece, Spain and Italy, all of which had seen a significant decline in unemployment, raising the question of why. Why had Portugal's economy stagnated in what were supposed to be the good times? What was the impact of its long history as a colonial power? And to what extent did a 19th century letter from Pope Leo XIII influence its wider economic approach? For those watching this an hour after upload, we'll be going live to answer any of your questions on the AltSimplified Discord server. You can join by clicking the link in the description below. Now, a good place to start is Portugal's long and varied economic history. So, how has Portugal's history impacted its economy? For centuries, the nation had been a trade-based colonial empire, but by the 1900s, the days of empire were numbered. And whilst it would go on to maintain its colonial possessions way into the 20th century, Portugal was facing an economic crisis at home. After facing near bankruptcy in the 1920s, the 30s saw the country fall under the dictatorship of António Salazar, who ruled for the next 4 decades, launching an economic system called Estado Novo, or the New State. This was neither capitalist nor communist, being based on the economic ideology of corporatism, an idea which called for the organisation of society into major interest groups, following a very hierarchical format, one inspired decades earlier by Pope Leo XIII, who in 1891 published a letter sent across the Catholic world, rejecting what he saw as unrestricted capitalism and the illusions of socialism. Trivia aside, corporatism played a significant role in Portugal for decades, being underpinned by extensive state regulation, but still allowing for the private ownership of the means of production. Perhaps the best example of this in practice was the country's strict industrial licensing, requiring government approval to invest in machinery or equipment, with everything from wages to prices being heavily regulated. Now, whilst this kept public finances and inflation under control, economic growth and improvements to standard of living were kept pretty modest. Skipping over a lot of history, the end of the Second World War saw a largely neutral Portugal start to look outwards to the world. A beneficiary of the Marshall Plan for European economic recovery, trade barriers began to decline, being the only non-industrialised nation to join the European Free Trade Area in 1959, an opportunity Portugal didn't let go to waste, using it to increase trade with wealthy Western European markets, resulting in double-digit economic growth by the early 70s, as it transitioned from agriculture to light industry, particularly textiles. Yet this also coincided with rising unrest and costly revolutionary wars in its colonies. You see, whilst other countries were engaging in decolonisation, the government's solution was to increase economic integration with its colonies, primarily by liberalising trade and creating a common currency, the Escudo Area. Though it's important to note that, rather unsurprisingly, integration still by and large favoured Portugal. By the time of Salazar's death in 1970, maintaining colonies had become increasingly expensive and politically costly to the undemocratic government, a key factor behind Portugal's 1974 military coup, an eventual transition to democracy, bringing its colonial wars to an end in the process. The next 2 decades saw the country go through a series of economic crises, racking up large levels of public debt, eye-watering rates of inflation, and IMF assistance. Now, a significant turning point came with Portugal entering the European Economic Community, the precursor to the European Union. This really helped focus Portugal's policies on macroeconomic stability. And as discussed in previous videos, when the opportunity appeared to join a currency union with the likes of Germany, this sounded very appealing. As a result, Portugal focused on stabilising its currency, dramatically lowering the rate of inflation and bringing debt down to 50% of GDP, a relatively low level for the country. All great news and driven by the economic expectation that a boom would follow the adoption of the euro. But this never really materialised. Why? What happened to Portugal's economy? Comparing its lacklustre economic growth to the other main players in the Eurozone crisis helps highlight just how poorly the country performed. You see, Portugal didn't experience a housing bubble anywhere near the likes of Spain or Ireland, a result of a much more realistic supply and demand balance, alongside stricter lending by Portuguese banks. What's interesting is that the rush of money flowing from the wealthy core to the periphery was accompanied by underperformance. And just like other economies, a big factor was where the money actually ended up when it reached Portugal. A lot of it found its way into the non-tradable services sector as opposed to the tradable manufacturing sector, meaning this money wasn't invested in improving production, contributing to low-level gains in productivity, whilst at the same time the nation was tied to a much more expensive currency. Ultimately, this discrepancy expressed itself in the country becoming less and less competitive, made worse by the types of goods that it actually exported. Given it was relatively late to industrialise, Portugal's export base wasn't as skilled as many of its Eurozone partners, relying on more labour-intensive exports. Alongside the impact of China entering the World Trade Organization in 2001 and the expansion of the European Union in 2004, events which put additional pressure on its exports shortly after adopting the euro. Now, a clear consequence of this was a worsening of its current account. For a while, the country was able to pay this widening trade gap through several things. Firstly, consumer growth had been exceeding general economic growth, something made possible by ever greater levels of external household debt, rising by more than 200% of GDP in less than 15 years. Secondly, these imports were funded by a drastic decline in savings, not something unique to Portugal, but a response to the much lower savings rates being offered on bank accounts. To be fair though, the country's rising debts weren't just a result of a big spending spree, at least not when it came to public finances. Increased government spending was largely accounted for by rising pension payments and higher levels of unemployment. Also, contrary to most of its peers, taxes had actually increased to help pay for its rising pension costs. When it came to the state of its financial industry, somewhat surprisingly, the banking sector entered the 2008 crisis in relatively good health. The solvency levels of its 5 largest banks were in line with international standards. So, what was the issue? Well, the real issue was how these banks were funded. Financial integration with the Eurozone had led them to rely heavily on international financial markets, with a relatively low domestic credit market. So, when the financial crisis hit, refinancing for the banks became a very expensive exercise, especially as most of them had invested heavily in government debt through bonds, which became increasingly risky to hold as the ability of governments to pay their debts were called into question. Once you add in the rising defaults on all those household loans into the mix, the outlook started to look very bleak. Now, all of this represented yet another factor contributing to Portugal having to be bailed out to the tune of 78 billion euros in 2011, raising the question of what impact Portugal's bailouts actually had. The bailouts preceded years of economic pain, forcing the government to embark on swinging austerity cuts to everything from education spending to the number of bank holidays, all to bring the country's rising public deficits under control. Though it's important to remember that the nation's budget deficits were as much a symptom of its economic woes as a cause. The real goal was improving the economy's productivity and competitiveness, and this is where Portugal's real challenge began, given the structure of its export base we mentioned earlier. However, structural reforms led to rising competitiveness. According to the World Economic Forum, the competitiveness ranking of Portugal's economy did improve, increasing by 12 places in the last 10 years. Rising competitiveness also saw an improvement in its balance of trade. Initially, this was as much a consequence of falling imports as rising exports, though the fact its exports continued to rise as a percentage of GDP indicate widespread structural reform. Now, by the time Portugal exited its bailout, its economic fortunes had improved, though at the cost of an eye-watering 16% unemployment rate and an even higher rate amongst its young population, which became such a problem that many of its young skilled population decided to move abroad, leading to not only a brain drain but a continuous decline in its population since the beginning of the crisis. Now, the end of the country's bailout period coincided with a change of government, one which rejected the austerity-led policies which had proven so unpopular. something leading to rising concerns that Portugal would slip back into old habits which had led to its bailouts in the first place. However, on the surface at least, the country's economy continued to expand. In truth, the real impact of the government's policy is extremely difficult to view in isolation, as Portugal's performance was matched by a strong global economy, falling oil prices, and an international boom in tourism. Also, some point out that the painful measures taken during the bailout years helped set the economy on a better path. Raising an important question: is Portugal on a better path today? The events of 2020 had global repercussions, and Portugal was no exception to these. However, as is often the case, whilst most countries suffered, not all countries suffered equally. IMF data suggested it was the third worst performer in Europe, if you exclude the microstate of San Marino. Sorry to any viewers from San Marino. A core driver of this poor performance had been the country's large tourist sector, not to mention that its only neighbour and by far largest trading partner Spain experienced the largest decline in Europe. Taking a step back, the 4 years in the lead up to 2020 saw the economy grow faster than the Eurozone average. But let's not forget that for the 6 years before that, it also underperformed that average, sometimes considerably. Nonetheless, it's hard to escape the symbolic improvements made during its post-crisis period. For years a problem, its current account deficit has largely disappeared. Not to mention the fact that 2019 saw its first government budget surplus in decades. Yet significant challenges still remain. Public debt even before 2020 had been stubbornly high, well above 100% of GDP, which is important as it gives the government less fiscal headspace to respond to a crisis. The productivity gains it made in the immediate aftermath of its reforms have also stagnated, risking a widening gap with its core trading partners. And as previously alluded to, Portugal's public finances and long-term prosperity will come under increasing pressure from an ageing population. Though in fairness, given the huge sacrifices the country has made so far, it's already demonstrated to the world it can change. The question is whether it can continue to do so. So overall, Portugal's economy definitely has a few striking traits. Adopting an economic philosophy of corporatism, with all its hierarchical structures, has to be seen in the context of its dictatorship and colonial-style economy, factors which would ultimately go on to slow down its economic modernisation and export base, forming a core part of its widening trade deficits after joining the euro. What's really interesting though is how it didn't experience the same level of growth other Eurozone crisis economies did in the early 2000s. The impact and results of its bailouts are still hotly debated, given just how hard or basically impossible it is to identify the true impact of changes and the chain reaction of events which often follow. But that's precisely why economics is so interesting, or at least to us. And now it's over to you. Do you think Portugal's economy was well on its way to recovery before 2020? Is it fair to say it's one of the worst hit economies in Europe? Or does San Marino deserve more of the spotlight? There is so much to cover, we couldn't possibly fit it all in. So we'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are in the comments below. And if you're watching this shortly after upload, we'll be going live on the Discord server to answer any questions. If you think we've earned it, consider giving us a like and subscribing. And as always, see you in the next video.